Welcome to Mastering MEL for Maya, a free companion to my popular Python for Maya course, linked in the video description below. In part 3 of this video series, we'll be going over variables. Variables are a way to give names to data so that we can refer to them easily without needing to keep track of what the data actually is. They're a fundamental aspect of programming. A variable is a way of giving a nickname to data so that we can refer to it easily later. There are two categories of variables inside of Maya, simple and compound. Let's start with simple variables. The first type of simple variable is a string. We define a string variable by giving it its type, so we say string. Then we give the variable a name. In this case, I'll use username. Notice that variables must always start with a $sign. This is how a MEL knows that it's a variable. If we want to give the variable a value, we say equals, and then in double quotes we give it the value we need. The value is optional. If you don't provide this part, Maya will just give it a default value of an empty string. If we now say print username and run this, you can see that it's printed my name through, because username refers to that value. There are also two numeric types. The first is an integer, which refers to any whole number without a decimal point. So we say int, which is short for an integer, and then we give the variable a name. In this case, I'll say age, and I'm going to give it a value of 26. And if I say print age and run this, you can see that it prints 26. If I try to give it a decimal point, it will ignore anything after the decimal point. If you do want to have a number that includes decimal points, you use float. If I try and run this, it will error. This is because MEL does not let you redefine a variable as another type once it's been created. So instead of age, let's give it a new name, cost, and I'll give it 60.5. If I now print cost, you can see that it's equal to 60.5. Other than the three simple variables, we also have three compound variables. First up is an array, which is a list of a single type of variables. We define this the same way we define other variables. Let's define a string array. So we say string, we give it the variable name, so we'll say usernames. And to make it an array, we simply put two square brackets at the end of the variable name. And to give it a value, we use curly braces, and inside that, we give it the values separated by commas. So I'm going to say David, Larry, John, and Adrian. If I now print usernames, and notice we don't need to use the square brackets to refer to it right now, I'll print out each of the elements. We can also access individual elements inside of the array by using the square brackets and giving a number. So let's say if I want to access David, it's the first element, but instead of using the number 1, we must use the number 0. This is because computers start counting from 0. So it actually goes 0, 1, 2, 3. So if I now print username 0, we get David. We can also use the square brackets to reassign values. So I can say usernames 0 is equal to Linda. If I now run this, you can see that username 0 is equal to Linda. And if I print the full array, you can see that it now says Linda, Larry, John, and Adrian. If you want to get the size of an array, we can use the size function. So we can say print size of usernames. If you try and run this right now, it will error. This is because print doesn't know that it has to run this first to get its value. We could use backticks on either side of the command, and print will evaluate it. Or we can simply put it inside of parentheses. And print will evaluate it as well. We can also use size to add on to an array. So I'm going to say usernames, and in square brackets, I'll get the size of the usernames. So again, backticks to evaluate it, and we'll say size usernames is equal to, and I'm going to give it a value of Nancy. If I now say print usernames, you can see that it's added an element to the end of the list. This is because size gives us the value 4, because there are 4 elements here. But because computers start counting from 0, it's actually the 5th element, and we're assigning a 5th element. If we ran it again, we would get the number 5 from size, which would add it to the 6th spot in usernames, and so on and so forth. In addition to arrays, we also have a type called vector. We define this by saying vector, and in this case I'm just going to call it vec, and we give it the values inside 2 less than signs and 2 greater than signs. It can only contain float values, so in this case I'm going to say 1.1, 2.2, and 3.3. If I now print vec, you can see that it gives us the float values. I can also access any of these elements using vec.x, but if I run it like this, it will error. This is because it needs to be inside of parentheses. And if I now run it, I get 1.1, 2.2 for vec.y, and 3.3 for vec.z. In addition to vectors and arrays, we have another compound type called matrix. A matrix is a nested array, which means it's an array that contains another array that can only contain float values. We create it by saying matrix, and I'm going to call this my matrix. And unlike an array, you need to define its size first. So I'm going to create an array that is 3 wide and 2 deep. If I now print out my matrix, so you can see that it goes 3 by 2. You can also redefine values inside of a matrix by saying my matrix, and I'm going to say 0 and 1 is equal to 2.0. If I now run this, you can see that my position at 0 and 1 is now equal to 2. Now that we understand variables a bit, let's see how we can use this with our Maya commands. Let's store our polycube inside of a variable. If we look back at our document, if we look at the documentation for polycube, we can see that it returns a string array of the object name and the node name. So let's define a variable. So we'll say string myCube, and we'll convert it to an array, is equal to, and then we'll use backticks so that Maya knows to evaluate whatever is inside it, and we'll say polycube. So if we say print myCube and run this, you can see that myCube is equal to pcube1 and polycube1. We can create another cube by saying string another cube, and we'll make it an array, is equal to polycube again. If I now say print another cube and run it, you can see that it's created a cube and it's equal to pcube3 and polycube3. Now I can select any of these by saying select, and I can give it one of these variables. So I can say myCube, and if I select and if I run this, it selects the cube created here. But I can change it to another cube, and instead it will select that cube. This way we can maintain references to objects we've created without needing to know their names, and instead Maya's variables will handle that for us.
If you're interested in learning more about programming inside of Maya, check out my popular Python for Maya course, which is linked in the video description below.